Today I'm going to tell you a story about an 11th century princess, a messy divorce, and a satanic sex cult. Or maybe that's not your thing. What if I told you that I heard that the Countess of Tuscany was sleeping with the Pope? Today, we're talking scandal. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel, Making History. I'm Dr. Erica Sigurdsson, and in this video, we're going to be learning about the medieval rumor mill and some of the ways medieval rulers tried to harness it to control their image or smear their enemies. We're in the second half of the 11th century today. Politically, Europe was settling into a configuration kind of recognizable to us today, with the kingdoms of England and France and an entity known as the Holy Roman Empire, which spanned Germany, much of Italy, and some parts of Central Europe. So those three monarchs were emerging as the big players in European politics. But another big player was coming onto the scene. So over the centuries previous, the church had been growing steadily wealthier and had come to control more and more territory. And it was getting organized. A reform movement was brewing, and it was ready to pick some fights. And the first of those fights would be with the Holy Roman Emperor in something known as the investiture controversy. So the investiture controversy was this decades-long conflict between the popes in Rome, starting to flex those muscles, and Henry IV, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. So the issue being fought over, as the name implies, was something called investiture. Investiture was the power to appoint important church leaders like bishops, archbishops, and sometimes even popes. These people were spiritual leaders, but they were also secular princes. They controlled a lot of wealth and they had a lot of power. So the ability to decide who was selected for that position was an important one. Once someone was invested and consecrated as bishop, they were in for life. They were independent. So you really only had this one opportunity to make sure that the right kind of person was put in this powerful position. They were kind of like Supreme Court justices in that way. So it had long been the practice that German bishops were selected by the German king, or the Holy Roman Emperor. Just a few generations before, even the popes were appointed by the emperor, with a council of cardinals to ratify whatever the emperor wanted. The actual details of the conflict are excellent, but we're not going to get into them very much today. Because one thing that happened very quickly, actually, with the investiture controversy is it stopped being about investiture, actually. It got personal. So because of this, what I want to focus on today is the role of scandal and rumor as a kind of war of propaganda, a war that was being waged on both sides. Why? Well, partly because I enjoy a good scandal, but also scandals reveal interesting things about a culture, what it values, what it hates, how it expects people to act. A scandal, fundamentally, is the exposure of behavior that violates cultural norms or expectations. And when we're dealing with a society so far removed from our own, as historians, we can look to scandals for a better understanding of social norms in that society. They give us a little bit of insight into the things that people living in that society might prefer to keep hidden. Now, the two scandals I'm going to be talking about today were both probably made up, which is another interesting thing about scandal, isn't it? As we'll see, a fabricated scandal can have all the same consequences as a true one. But it does create a bit of a puzzle for historians. What do we do with a genuine historical lie? So back to the investiture conflict, I think it's really fascinating that the most iconic moment of the investiture conflict, the thing that we historians all know about and tend to spend most of our time talking about, was, well, not a scandal, but also, in its own way, entirely about image management. That's right, I'm talking about Canossa. Canossa was a meeting between Henry and Gregory at this early point in that messy drama at an Alpine fortress, a castle called Canossa. So the meeting at Canossa was an attempt at reconciliation between the two of them, but it wasn't a reconciliation on equal footing. So I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but Henry was in a very weak position at this point and faced the genuine threat of losing his entire kingdom, hence the attempt at reconciliation. And because Henry needed it more than Gregory, he was the one who had to do the groveling. So famously, the meeting at Canossa involved Henry waiting for 3 days outside the gates of Canossa formally begging the Pope to forgive him his sin. Over those 3 days, he did penance in a hair shirt, barefoot in the snow, before Pope Gregory graciously let him in and forgave him. It's a powerful image, right? The Holy Roman Emperor, supposedly the most powerful ruler in Europe, on his knees, in the winter, in the snow. And it's a story with staying power. Over the centuries, the walk to Canossa has been told and retold. It's been depicted in art and in poems. It's turned into an idiom. So in German and Italian, and I think some other languages, going to Canossa is an expression that means something kind of like the English, eating humble pie. So the staying power of this image is a reminder of how good medieval rulers were at pageantry. Now, they weren't playing it up for the cameras like politicians do today, but in a situation like Canossa, there wasn't really a crowd. It was an intimate little gathering. One pope, one emperor, 3 mediators, and their respective entourages. In that scenario, they were playing to the chroniclers. They were aware that this meeting, and especially Henry's theatrical display of repentance, was a story. It was something to be told and retold and used. But that's not really a scandal. That's a public relations stunt. For our first example of an actual scandal, we can go back in time a little bit and look at Henry's role in growing the conflict between the two of them up to that point. So in 1076, Henry convened a synod of German bishops and convinced them to repudiate Gregory, declare that Gregory wasn't the pope anymore. And why? Well, they were fighting over who got to pick the new bishop of Milan, for one thing. But Henry needed something with slightly wider appeal, and so what he went for was the women. A standard smear tactic, popular throughout the Middle Ages, was the adultery rumor. There's basically not a single queen or prominent noblewoman from this time period who wasn't accused at one point or another of having an affair with someone or another, whoever also wasn't well liked at the time. Also, kings? They couldn't be hurt by accusations of sleeping with women. They were supposed to do that. But a close male friend, a trusted advisor, that could be a story. These accusations could harm the queens, of course, but they were usually intended to harm their husbands. And unsurprisingly, this could also work as a smear tactic against high-level church officials, even the Pope. So here is the accusation made by the German bishops towards Pope Gregory. In this affair, our sense of decency is affected. Although the general complaint is sounded everywhere that all judgments and all decrees are enacted by women in the apostolic see, and ultimately that the whole orb of the church is administered by this new senate of women. In other words, Gregory had women friends and women allies. He allegedly listened to them and respected their opinions. And in the opinion of Henry, and his definitely not coerced group of bishops, that was pretty sus. So Pope Gregory did have a lot of close political friendships with women. He wrote letters to several of the most prominent women in Europe, and he cultivated them as donors to the church, as supporters of his reformist goals, and in the case of one woman, Matilda of Tuscany, as his main military backer against Henry. And Gregory was very aware of how his female friendships had this potential to be twisted and misrepresented. You can see this in a letter that he wrote in 1074, so a few years before Canossa, to Matilda and to her mother. It has not escaped you that reports of various kinds about you are often brought to us, as is in the way of those jealous of the love and unanimity of friends. So there were 2 prongs to the attack on Gregory through his relationship with women. The first is what we see from the Bishop's Synod, this insinuation that Gregory was letting women have opinions and influence over his decision-making. Gregory could be made to look weak and decadent because of this strong relationship with women. But the second prong is what Gregory was kind of hinting at in his letter to Matilda and her mother, this reports of various kinds about you. So it was widely put out by the pro-Henry propagandists, not by Henry, by people who supported him, that Gregory and Matilda were more than just friends. Matilda was an incredibly wealthy countess and ruler of at least 5 separate duchies, which included most of northern Italy and big parts of what's now France. She was also a huge believer in the ideals of Gregorian reform, seemingly genuine in her convictions. She was a devoted supporter of Gregory and of later popes who pursued his reform policies. She gave tons of money to the cause, and when it did blow up into an actual war with Henry, she was the primary supplier of military power to the Pope. In other words, Gregory needed her. It was good politics to stay on good terms with her, and he was good at it. Now, it's hard to say. You could interpret this friendship cynically and say that Gregory was, developing her, like a politician or a charity organization developing a wealthy donor. Or you could be more generous, and you might choose to interpret it as a genuine, warm friendship between two people with shared ideals and shared goals. That's kind of maybe more where I would lean. But either way, Gregory's close relationship with Matilda was good for him. It was a strength. But because she was a woman, that relationship was also a weakness that Gregory's opponents could exploit. And it worked. There's evidence that Gregory pulled back from his female friendships after Canossa. He especially pulled back from his friendship with Matilda. He wrote her significantly less after that. We know of only one letter from him to her after that time. There's no other reason that we know of why he would write to her so much less after this. She still supported him, but Gregory seems to have felt he had to put distance between them, at least publicly, in order to protect himself and her from rumors about their close friendship and their supposed love affair. Okay, you've been very patient. I promise you satanic sex cults. Alleged satanic sex cults. I promise you a beautiful princess entrapped in an alleged satanic sex cult. And you have very patiently waited through clerical reforms, German politics, and Matilda of Tuscany. We're there now, and I want to share with you this final example in the life of Henry IV. A real masterclass in the manipulation of rumor, scandal, and reputation. This is the story of Eupraxia Vsevoldovna. Born around 1071, Eupraxia Vsevoldovna was the daughter of the Prince of Kiev. Her first marriage was at the age of 11 to a young German prince named Henry, the Margrave of Saxony. So he was only a couple years older, and he died in 1087 when she was just 16. A year later, she was betrothed to another Henry, this one twice her age, and Holy Roman Emperor. That's right! In 1089, so a little over a decade after the humiliation of Canossa, Henry married a 17-year-old princess of Rus. So politically, this would have been a bit of a coup, an alliance with the Prince of Kiev. And personally, well, Henry might not have had the best relationship with his first wife. I don't know. It's always hard to know for sure about the inner lives of kings and public figures, but he didn't seem to have liked her very much. He didn't have a lot of choice in that marriage, for one thing. He even tried to divorce her when he was 19, but he failed because her mother threatened to start a war over it. But with this marriage, his second marriage, he had every reason to think that Eupraxia would not have that kind of power against him. She was very young, her family was powerful, but far away. What were they going to do if she was unhappy? What could she do? Well, he found that out the hard way. Just a few years into the marriage, Henry was at war with Matilda again. His eldest son, Conrad, had defected to the Pope's side and was fighting against his father in the war, and Eupraxia was done with her marriage. So she defected and ran away. And where did she go? To the fortress of Canossa. Canossa, eh? Nothing good comes out of Canossa, at least if you're Henry. Anyway, Eupraxia went there to claim support and protection from Matilda. And with Matilda's help, Eupraxia took her story to the public and to the Pope himself. Not Gregory anymore, he had died a few years before, but his successor, Pope Urban II. And here's the story. Eupraxia told the world that her husband was a Nicolaitan. The Nicolaits are so called from Nicolaus, deacon of the Church of Jerusalem, who, along with Stephen and the others, was ordained by Peter. He abandoned his wife because of her beauty, so that whoever wanted to might enjoy her. The practice turned into debauchery, with partners being exchanged in turn. So Nicolaitans were swingers. But by the 11th century, on top of the whole white swapping thing, Nicolaitans were also known to be Satan worshippers. So the story was that Nicolaitans would perform something called a black mass, and they would worship Satan in this deliberate mockery of the real mass. So it was designed to be kind of like a mass, but all upside down and gross. So instead of a normal altar made of stone in a church, Nicolaitans were using the lower part of a naked woman for their altar. Instead of a normal priest transfiguring bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, now again, I want to be very clear, allegedly would collect menstrual blood and semen and use that. So it's this very disgusting, deliberate parody of the sanctity of the Eucharist. So there's no evidence that I know of that anyone actually did this, by the way. But that means it's an interesting question to think about. What does it mean that lots of people in the 11th century believed that this did actually happen? What social norms were being violated? So that is what Eupraxia was accusing her husband of doing. Her husband, by the way, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the king of Germany and Italy and Burgundy, eating semen off of a naked woman's backside and worshiping the literal devil. Oh yeah, and also forcing her into his satanic, wife-swapping, orgy-astic lifestyle. Unfortunately, we don't have her initial letter to the Pope. The earliest account of her accusations tells us, Eupraxia complained that she had suffered so many and such unheard of filthy acts of fornication with so many men as would cause even her enemies to excuse her flight from her husband and move all Catholics to compassion for her great injuries. So Eupraxia claimed that at first she participated in this out of naivety and love for her husband, that she was trying to be a good wife, but that she became horrified and disgusted by everything that was going on when she got pregnant and realized that she had no idea and actually no way of knowing who the father was. So historians nowadays, because they are buzzkills, don't believe that this actually happened. But like I was saying in the beginning, that's interesting too, right? If there were no satanic orgies, Eupraxia and Matilda made this story up and told it to the world. So even in a political context where scandals were often fabricated and known to be fabrications, this wasn't a tactic without risk for Eupraxia herself. So there's been a tendency in contemporary history writing to downplay Eupraxia's role and kind of doubt her agency, to say that she was being used by Matilda or used by the Pope. It's possible, but we need to be careful, even nowadays looking back, to notice when our own assumptions might be coming into play. So I would suggest that to get out of her marriage, Eupraxia had to play into the stereotypes of the day. She had to play up the angle that made her sympathetic to a bunch of unmarried moralists. And that angle was naive innocent. A young woman trying to obey and love her husband, gradually seduced into these unspeakable filthy acts. The victim, not the perpetrator, of a deliciously horrible scandal. So I wonder, when these historians write her off as just a pawn of Matilda or a pawn of the Pope, are they falling for her act too? So I don't know why Eupraxia wanted out of her marriage. I don't think there's enough evidence there to make anything other than a series of wild guesses. What I do know is that in the end, she got what she wanted. Like Henry at Canossa, Eupraxia had to take a bit of public humiliation to get there. Unlike Henry, though, she controlled the narrative of that humiliation, making a clear case for herself as the naive victim and Henry as the villain of that scandal. Look, did she get help? Did Matilda write the whole storyline herself? Maybe. I don't know. But Eupraxia played it out. So one chronicle tells us that she gave a speech to the Papal Synod in 1095. The account in this chronicle, which is admittedly brief, just a couple sentences, ends by telling us that Pope Urban immediately absolved her for her part in the wrongdoing, saying that since she had admitted her sin immediately and publicly, she need not blush for it. And she got her divorce. Well, technically, she lived separated from her husband until his death. But her actions at the Papal Synod ensured that freedom for her. She got for herself what Henry couldn't manage to do for himself when he tried at the age of 19 to divorce his first wife. Eupraxia got to stay separated. After the synod, Eupraxia lived with her stepson for a few years, then traveled in state to visit her relatives in Hungary before ending back home in Kiev, where she became a nun and possibly an abbess, and where, on her death, she was accorded numerous honors. So I don't see a naive pawn who was forced to support the papal cause until her usefulness ended. I see a political actor working within the 11th century propaganda machine to get what she needed, seeking powerful allies and working with them to sell a scandalous story she knew the world would eat up, and making sure to protect herself from backsplash by leveraging stereotypes, by playing the role of this earnest, naive young bride, victimized by her husband, and seduced away from morality, just long enough to gain some nice lurid stories to tell about it. But oh so sorry, now that she's woken up to the sinfulness of it all. It's great, right? Eupraxia was great. So today we've looked at two scandals, both probably made up as part of this ongoing hostility between a reforming pope and a recalcitrant emperor. At the start of this video, I asked the question, what do we as historians do with historical sources that are lies, that are made up? What do we make of a made-up scandal? Well, one obvious part is to look at the real-life consequences. Matilda was harmed, at least somewhat, by the rumor that she was having an affair with the Pope. Her real-life friendship was hampered by this need to think of appearances. And Eupraxia could have been harmed, but she came out the other side with the freedom she'd been seeking and a reputation seemingly perfectly intact. Eupraxia was able to leverage this scandal to get out of her marriage and get out of Germany. Another thing we might think about is what these scandals can tell us about 11th century society. We might want to notice in these scandals fear of women, maybe a fear of powerful women, a tendency to conflate women's power. Remember Gregory's Senate of Women with their sexuality and with seduction, with weakness in men. And finally, I'll just note how fluid the boundaries could be between propaganda and history, between truth and lies. Eupraxia's stories of orgies and Satan worship live in the same space as Henry's barefoot walk to Canossa. One of those things historians assume to be more or less true, one we take as a lie. But both were operating fundamentally the same way, to shape perceptions and manage the monarch's public image. Anyway, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments, and please, if you liked any part of what we did today, stick with me and keep an eye out for future videos. I'm looking forward to making them. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.